Well, welcome to Friday. I hope that you are wrapping up the week well and are feeling good about how things are coming to a close, especially in this fifth week of being in quarantine. This week, I've gotten a chance to connect with some of the senior families around uh, or just that are out there. We've been delivering signs, and it's been a neat opportunity to just face to face have a chance to see some heralds and just to give them support. But even as I've done that, it's definitely made me realize that I've missed having you guys in class, and I hope that, yeah, even as a way or extension here, you've felt cared for even in other classes. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but yeah, it's just another reminder that you guys are a very big and important part of the whole fabric of Whittier Christian. Hey, as we're wrapping up the week, I want you to tell me, please, about the difference between a Cold War and a hot war. We talked about this at the tail end of Wednesday's lesson. If you would tell me about that difference, that would be great. As we step into this window of the Cold War and begin to see how that's going to play out, as we think about the Soviet Union and slash Russia, there's going to be a huge push as we come away from World War II by the United States to stem the tide or to prevent the growth of communism, to make sure this does not begin to take over. Already, Russia has made rumblings about pushing west and taking over countries that hadn't been part of their land before. But the United States says we need to now contain communism where it is. President Truman came up with a new policy called containment. He said we want to make sure that the Soviets' efforts to expand their ways of government are stunted and they're not allowed to now spread into the eastern part of Europe. And the way that they're going to do that is by sending resources. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Truman's really nervous, though, about the spread of communism, realizing that if this begins to take over, it could spread across the whole globe. And so he's now making a very key effort to make sure that that doesn't happen. This will be kind of further down the road in a couple of conflicts that we're going to be a part of. Not a Cold War, but actually a hot war, or a couple of them. But in this case, Truman says we want to now block the growth of the USSR. This is going to be called the Truman Doctrine, wherein he gives financial support to the different countries that are vulnerable if they're maybe weakened, instead of necessarily giving over to a wealthy Soviet Union that might come in and give them assistance. Truman is now pumping dollars into Europe to make sure that they are able to hang on and stem the tide, even by funding military efforts to make sure that they can push back against communism. Well, even as the war concludes, the United States is heavily involved in getting Europe back on its feet. They want to make sure that, especially as we think about economic ramifications, that Western Europe isn't just forgotten. And so they're going to start sending a lot of money to Europe. But it's not just about dollars. We'll talk about the financial cost in just a second. But George Marshall, the Secretary of State, says that we need to now give supplies to the different countries of Europe. He says we ought to now pump in machinery to help them get their infrastructure back up and off the ground. Obviously, food is going to be a huge part of that, where people have the ability to have sustenance. He said food is going to be a key part. Clothing is another element. And finally, medical supplies. There's a lot of other things that you could probably put in with this. So these are goods that are going to be sent to the different countries in Europe following the end of World War II to make sure that they're able to keep going. Well, the Soviets are going to take over the country of Czechoslovakia. That's going to be one of the countries to fall or convert, if you will, to communism. And with that in mind, the United States says we need to act now. And so they're going to send $12.5 billion to the different nations of Europe, making sure that they are given ample supply of financial resources to prevent communism from spreading further west. As you look at that, obviously this is going to be really good for Europe, but, and I don't think that this would take a rocket scientist to figure out, if they're going to give $12.5 billion to a different continent, somebody is going to foot the bill for that. They can't just print money and send it there. There's going to be a cost, and the ones that are going to bear that are going to be the American taxpayers. They're the ones that are going to have to underwrite and support what's happening in Europe. There's a political cartoon that I'd like to share with you again that kind of exemplifies this. You can see the American taxpayer. Perhaps for some of you, you can remember when you were learning how to ride a bike. Maybe that's too long ago. For some of you, maybe last year. But anyhow, as you look at this, you're going to see the American taxpayer there on the right challenging and encouraging the European nations to keep pumping. If you start learning how to ride a bike, sometimes you get kind of tentative or whatever. But if they can pedal on their own, they're going to be able to support themselves. And you can see the caption there at the bottom. He's finally getting the hang of it. Well, it's going to take a while before Europe, quote unquote, gets the hang of it and is able to support themselves fully. But at this point, you're going to see the American taxpayers having to bear a brunt of keeping Europe afloat. One of the more important things that's going to happen at this point, as you look at this, as you looked at what we talked about on Wednesday, we talked about the division of Germany. And one of the key things that was going to be the Western half was no problem, but that really should say, instead of Western Germany, it should say Western Berlin, because that was the Allied held area within Berlin. And the Russians have cut off any naval connections and any land connections from getting into Western Berlin. Their goal, like we talked about with the Cold War at the end on Wednesday, is to cut off Berlin and to make those people feel so stranded that they would then choose communism. Well, the Allies say we're going to now send goods into Western Berlin to make sure they're able to stay afloat. Every day you're going to see the German citizens getting food and clothing. You can see even on the right side there milk. They're going to be delivered daily to a place called Tempelhof Airport. They literally will bring in tons of food. I think I read somewhere that it was like 5,000 tons of just ridiculous amount per day. Countries from around the western half of Europe even contributing and saying, we want to now make sure that the Germans in West Berlin are able to survive. As you look here, Tempelhof Airport becomes the main landing hub to be able then to disperse these goods to the Western Berliners. Kind of a cool story. Again, you don't have to take notes on it, but there was a guy who noticed that kids would gather by the airport as they saw that these transport planes would be landing. They would gather right outside the chain link fence of the airport. And he started to think, what can I do for those kids? And so he began putting candy on little parachutes and dropping it onto or by the kids. And they called that guy the candy bomber. There were a few others that came after and did similar things, but just as a way of trying to take care of the younger Berliners, as a way of saying, we care about you too. Well, finishing out here for part one, you're going to see the United States joining this thing called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There's 15 countries that are put together, and basically they're saying, if any of us are attacked, we will commit to supporting the other 14 countries. A lot of this, again, is going to stem or come off of World War II. This is different than the UN. But this is our way as an alliance here of 15 countries of saying we will have one another's back. However, as you think about the possibilities of what could happen, America is also nervous. They've fought in 2 wars in the last 35 years or so that were not on American soil. But they still feel like this is an important connection to have in Europe with other countries that might need to have their back if Russia came and attacked the United States. So NATO becomes our place of connection, an opportunity to have different alliances, even with these countries that have been our partners and allies during World War II. As we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the development of these weapons that are going to take on in the Soviet Union. We'll talk a little bit about the beginning of spying, or at least our efforts toward that, and then we'll be done for this week. I hope that you guys have a good afternoon, and we'll see you during part 2.